Hello and welcome. This is Paul Sandhu. So this is a re-upload of some videos. Actually, I did a whole series on the history of creation. So I'm going to be re-uploading many of them with some updates. And this was the first one in a series that explains that the history of creation, as we are taught, both in the world and in the church, is mostly of fiction. Okay, so real history, it dates back many ages. It could be going back millions, even more years than we can count. And this is what I have learned about the time before time, let's say. So the video that you see playing in the beginning is of I was driving on the highway and I saw these two flatbed trailers that were transporting these large stones. Okay, and they are not even that large when you compare it to many of the megalithic structures that exist on our Earth. These are actually almost like pebbles in comparison to them. But what we can see is the difficulty that is involved in moving stones in our time. Like this one flatbed could only carry 3 or 4 of them at a time. I mean, if they could carry more, then they wouldn't have needed two trailers. They would have just loaded them onto one trailer. Okay, now imagine all those, like the pyramids or those megalithic structures in South America and Machu Picchu in Baalbek, Lebanon, where these stones are some like 1,000 to 2,000 tons. There's no technology that exists today that can move such massive objects. Yet they have been moved in the past. People have built with them. So you see, is that like people like us that built them, or were there other civilizations and races that existed before us that built worlds upon the earth about which we know very little? So the rest of this video is from a recording I did a few years ago. It was titled History of Creation Before Angels and Demons. This actually video was probably my most watched video ever, having some, lot more than 500,000 views. And it was on my original YouTube channel, which was deleted by YouTube some 2-3 years ago because of allegedly violating their community guidelines or something, some nonsense like that. But anyhow, so here it is once again. Greetings to all in the name of Jesus Christ, the Lord of Lords, and the King of Kings, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. All those who seek true understanding, the Bible tells us, they shall find. And this is the goal of this video series, which I have done on the history of creation as recorded in the pages of the Bible, and also by comparing it to other mythologies and other histories that exist in our world, to come to an understanding of two things. One is what happened in the past, and number two, why it happened. And this history that I've shared with you, it is not, although I teach it from a completely biblical perspective, it is not the type of history that is taught in Sunday school or in church, okay? This is not like, people think that they understand that the world was made in 6 days as recorded in the book of Genesis, and they think that's all there is to that story. But of course, there is much more, because the Bible, if it truly is the book in which are hidden all the secrets of wisdom and knowledge, all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge, as we are told, then the depth of it is truly infinite, and we can dig and search and search and dig and dig and search. And of course, we will only be just beginning to scratch the surface. So this video is a part of a series of videos on prehistoric history. By prehistoric history, I mean the history of ages that predate the age of this present civilization. The traditionally accepted and commonly taught history of modern civilization dates back some 5,000 years to the Sumerians, followed by the Babylonians, Egyptians, Persians, Indians, Greeks, Romans, and down to the present day. However, both in the Bible and in mythology, as well as in the legends and oral traditions of various cultures and peoples, such as the Native Americans, there are stories and histories of one or more civilizations that came and went long before this present age. The characters in these stories are not just humans, but superhumans, much like superheroes of comic books. And other fantastic creatures such as giants, cyclops, human animal hybrids are commonly spoken of and written about in these fantastic tales. These stories are not just stories of men, but also of angels, of spirits, of demons, and of the gods, whose images have been drawn, painted, and carved in stone all over the world. Some of these stories are truly epic, such as Homer's Odyssey from Greece or the Mahabharata of Hindu mythology. And reading such works is much like watching a science fiction movie with fantastic modes of transportation, super weapons, and other technologies that were available to and were employed by the characters in these stories. Some of these technologies are truly so fantastic that even in the present day, man does not possess such Death Star like super weapons. These stories could easily be dismissed as fiction, and as a rule, they are so dismissed by mainstream historians. However, there is so much evidence found all over the world of civilizations that go much further back in time than just 5,000 years, and also of buildings and ruins that could only have been built using sophisticated power tools, and in many cases by people that must have been of much greater stature, literally giants in comparison to the average sized human being. It is thanks to many modern day Indiana Jones types explorers and archaeologists that we have a great deal of video and photographic evidence of prehistoric civilizations stretching to all four corners of the earth. The video playing on the screen is one such video that documents megalithic structures and anomalous ruins that are found all four corners of the earth, not just in one location like South America, but in Asia, Africa, Europe, everywhere that we look, there are these megalithic structures, and that tell us in stone, this is the evidence in stone, that for one thing, the earth has been inhabited in basically everywhere at some point in the past. And you know what? Like the extent of the construction, and most of it we may not even know about. Like, for example, stories that we hear about these places that are in the deep Amazon, which nobody has even explored. And of course, ruins that are of construction that is even inside the earth and even under the water. So that shows us the extent of the habitation that has occurred on the earth, and the population figures that we get, they are probably nowhere near the truth, that the number of people that have inhabited this earth has to be far greater than we have ever been told. But at the same time, this, of course, would not have happened just in the past 4,000 or 5,000 years, of which we have a pretty good written record. So these events and these places were built at another time, and it is the history of those times that I am trying to share with you here from a biblical history. It truly amazes me that even in the past 25 or so years, since I began studying and researching prehistoric history, there are more and more discoveries of ancient civilizations from South America to Europe to Asia to Africa, all over the world, both on the ground and in the seas and even in the oceans. In this video, I will feature some clips to show that real prehistory proves that the earth has been inhabited in just about every corner of it, not just above ground, but inside the earth and under the earth and even below the waters. Undersea structures may well be ruins of giant cities that were once above the ground. In this series, I will piece together, like a jigsaw puzzle, the history of prehistory by dividing time since the beginning of creation into 4 ages, much as they are found in the Bible and in Hindu and Greek mythologies. These ages are generally named after the names of precious and base metals called the gold, silver, bronze, and iron ages. So I will tell you a tale that is more fantastic than any fantasy story like that of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings books and movies. Tolkien's story, by the way, was lifted straight from the pages of the Bible, as I have documented in some videos on my channel, the links to which are in the description. What sets apart the series of videos that I have done in the past on the history of creation, and will add to in the future, from the thousands of other videos found on the net, and on ancient civilizations and on mythology, is the fact that I link the why of history to the events of history. It is not enough to understand that something happened in the past, going a long way back that has brought us to where we are today, but it is even more important to understand why it happened, and going even beyond the why it happened to understanding why it must needs have happened the way it happened. Many researchers and scholars have spent a lifetime documenting the evidence of very ancient civilizations on Earth, and sometimes they even look beyond Earth to explain their findings. For example, the Swiss author Erich von Däniken, with his Chariots of the Gods books and Ancient Aliens TV series, has documented dozens or even hundreds of sites around the world where megalithic and impossible to explain structures exist even today. However, they all fail to satisfactorily explain their findings as to who were the builders of these civilizations and why were they built and later destroyed, sometimes facing a very catastrophic and sudden end. So, what is the basis for so much documentation, both on paper and in stone, of these ancient worlds that stretch across the face of this earth? Are these all imaginary fictional stories concocted by various peoples and cultures in all parts of the earth from Siberia to South America? Or do these stories, which are documented on paper and stone, have a basis in truth? In order to understand the history of the ages, it is important to understand the author of the ages, who in the Bible is identified by the name of Jehovah, the self-existent one who has created all things, including time itself, and who therefore is not subject to time. Without crediting the events of history to the author of history, which according to my understanding is the God of the Bible, it is truly impossible to understand history. All that we are then left with are speculations and wild conjecturing, which ultimately fail to explain anything at all about history. In brief, history is a series of revelations from God over successive ages in which God, the creator of all things, revealed himself to his creatures, particularly to the race of angels and of men. The purpose of creation is for the Creator to interact with his creatures. Interaction between two parties is called a relationship, and that is the very purpose for which all things were created, for the Creator to have a relationship with his creatures. The Creator relates to all his creatures on differing levels. With angels, he shares his knowledge and power. But man was created for a different type of relationship with God than with the angels. Before God's creatures could begin to interact with him, that is, to have a relationship with him, God needed to show them who he is. He had to show them, to reveal to them his knowledge, his power, but even more importantly, he had to reveal to them his character. Without knowing God, his creatures could never relate to him, to interact with him, except perhaps on a superficial robotic level. This is the meaning of the word revelation in the Bible. It means it is an uncovering, like taking the lid off a pot to reveal its contents, or taking a sheet of cloth off a sculpture to reveal its shape, or like unwrapping a present to see what is inside the box. Since God, by definition, must be an infinitely complex being, the understanding of God's mind and heart must also be an infinitely complex process. This is the reason why many ages of time were necessary in order for God to slowly reveal himself to all creation. Without understanding the power of God, it is simply not possible to understand God. When people think of the power of God, they think of a voice that booms like thunder. They think of the waters covering the earth, destroying everything in their path, as in the flood of Noah. To think of fire and brimstone raining down from the heavens, destroying everything like Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed. In short, to think of God's power as the ultimate power of destruction, kind of like the Death Star in the Star Wars movies. There can be no doubt that God's power can indeed be destructive on a universal scale of truly biblical proportions. And this aspect of his power came to be understood by his creatures once evil entered into God's creation and the angels rose up in rebellion against him. When these angels fell, His creatures saw how easily he defeated that angelic host, that army of angels that stood up against him, and cast them down to hell to be reserved against the day of judgment. They came to know the greatness of his power, against which the mightiest of the angels had no power whatsoever in comparison. One of the questions that people frequently ask is, if God is good, why does evil exist? And one of the answers to that is that the history of evil teaches us that evil serves the purpose of challenging God's powers. And there's one power in particular, which I will discuss in great detail, which had to be challenged because when his powers were challenged, and God met the challenge and overcame and won, then we began to understand who our Creator is and what His powers, through His powers, okay, through the exercise of His powers, we came to understand the nature, the person, and the character of God. And evil had to arise. Like, for example, evil arose in the race of angels. In Ezekiel 28, we can read about the leader of these angels, who was called the anointed cherub, to whom God said that he was perfect in beauty and full of wisdom. I mean, that passage speaks greatly about this angel's power and his knowledge and his wisdom that God had given him. There was something that the angels lacked, that when that one characteristic or one quality is missing in a person, our power will always be used for evil purposes. And that is why it was going to happen. There was no way around it, that these angels eventually, some of them, would not turn to evil. They would. The more power they were given, the greater the odds that they would use it for evil purposes. And that quality that was lacking in them was called love. They did not understand love, and therefore it becomes impossible for them to control their power and use it only for benevolent purposes that God had given them. This is what happens, okay? This is one of the purposes evil serves. Evil is the challenge to power, which proves what the power of that person is, okay, that is being challenged. As, for example, in the Second World War, when Hitler challenged America, America became the greatest and most powerful nation on earth after the Second World War, replacing Britain, because it had been challenged, its power had been challenged, and it had faced that challenge and overcome that challenge. Now, I'm not talking here about the history of the Second World War, which is really nothing like what we are taught in history books, but nonetheless, this is how America came to be number one, is because its power was indeed challenged. And this is the same thing with God. God would show who He is when His power was challenged, and He would overcome all those challenges. And like I said, there's one power in particular which had to be challenged in all its aspects, which would bring Him, God, a lot of pain and suffering and even death eventually. But it needed to happen that way. In order for those events to happen the way they happened, evil had to arise. And there was no possible way that God could give some of these creatures great power that eventually they would not turn to evil, because as the old adage tells us, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Now, God is the only one that does have absolute power in all creations. This is only the Creator that does. Yet His power is not destructive. It is not malevolent. It is always benevolent. And why is that? And that is the understanding that we will gain through this series. Is, as I said, creation and its history is a series of revelations in which the Creator has been revealed to us, and those revelations have come through the challenges to His person, to His character, to His knowledge, to His kingship, to every aspect of His being. It had to be challenged so that He would prove to be the rightful ruler. He would prove to be that His power was indeed a power that saved, that was not destructive. It was a creative power. That is why He is the Creator. But until those powers were challenged, we have no way for us to know that, and there was no way for us to understand who our Creator really is. And so that is the purpose of teaching this history, is that through this history, we are not just going to gain a knowledge of what events transpired in the past, but we are going to understand, we're going to gain a knowledge of our Creator and why He purposed that these events must happen. He is the author of history. He wrote the book before it was written, he wrote the script of the movie before the movie played out. And therefore, we have to understand His reasoning as to why it happened. And thankfully, he has brought us that understanding so that we can understand. We don't have to be mystified. We don't have to be always, using guesswork. No, we can have great answers. We can have perfect answers, as a matter of fact, as to the questions of history. And they only come when we understand that there is an author of history. I would also like to draw your attention to this video that's playing on the screen, which some of which, clips of which are from a website called megaliths.org. And regrettably, this megaliths.org, they use some very occult symbols such as the all-seeing eye. So, those, I understand that most of these people and researchers, even like Eric von Daniken, etc., they do not believe in the Bible, which is regrettable, because if they did, then they would be able to interpret their findings in a much more scientific and reasoned manner, that what they're seeing is how these things came about to be. But so be it. So, but I just wanted to draw your attention to that, please, that I'm not endorsing any of these symbols, etc., that they use. I understand they're occult, they're evil, but it's the video itself that is of a greater interest than the symbols that are being displayed. So if you follow along in this series, you will come to understand, how God has revealed himself to us by allowing evil to come into existence. And the existence of evil, or the birth of evil, was inevitable, as I explained, because when power is given to a creature, great knowledge, but there's no understanding of love, eventually it will turn to evil. But God used that, and God knew that would happen, and that he would use it to actually display his powers, as he told Pharaoh in the days of Moses, for this reason have I raised thee up, that I may display my power in you, that evil serves a purpose of God. And the challenge to his powers is what has revealed to us. It has brought us a revelation of God. And as I said, God put down the rebellion of the angels. And that is just as an aside, people that teach that these angels came down in the days of Noah, those teachings are all false, because these angels I don't like to use the word fallen angels, because it really is not in the Bible. The Bible says it's the angels that sinned. But these angels and their sin and rebellion, it occurred in an age that came a long time before Noah. And they were, I believe, at the end of the Silver Age, which I will be discussing in my next video. These angels were imprisoned in hell, and that's where they are today. So none of us humans have had any interaction with these original angels that rebelled against God. Since then, there have arisen other creatures. Some of them are called demons, that we call demons, and the Bible calls them devils. These are different, they are distinct from those fallen angels. And how they came into existence and when, that I will discuss again in the video that follows, which will be on the Silver and Bronze Ages. This did not happen in the time of the Golden Age, which I'm speaking about today. So when God put down the rebellion of the angels, he faced that challenge and he met it quite easily, I'm sure. Then it became apparent, because some of these angels, we are told that it was something like 1/3 of them. I'm not sure about what the exact number is. I don't know if there's 1/3 that followed this anointed cherub in the beginning, when sin first arose and God's evil first came to be in God's creation, but it doesn't matter. Okay, anyhow, it could have been any number. So when some of these angels that actually followed this anointed cherub in his rebellion, they thought that they could overcome God and dethrone him and themselves sit as rulers of all creation, because they had a great deal of knowledge. They had a knowledge of science, they had a knowledge of technology, they had a knowledge of genetics. Basically a great deal of knowledge was given to them by God, so that, rather than understanding that they were creatures, they began to think of themselves as the creator. So when this rebellion was put down and they were cast down to hell, then the remaining creatures that would not join them in their rebellion, it was a revelation of God's power to them. They understood then that he had greater power than any of them. Okay, and this brought to them a revelation of who God is, as far as his power of creation and also of destruction is concerned. This knowledge came to them because of this rebellion that began in the race of angels. However, this understanding of God's power was but a kindergarten level education in the true understanding of the power and the might of God. What God needed to show his creatures, man in particular, was that the real secret to his power lay not in destroying but in saving, not in the taking of life but in the giving of life, that his power was controlled by the greatest of all his powers, which is the power of love. Ultimately, from amongst all his creatures, angels and men specifically, would be chosen to share his knowledge and power. God is all powerful, that is, all power that exists originates with him, and that power is infinite. Before God could share such infinite power with any of his creatures, first of all, he had to show them all facets of his power. And secondly, he had to teach them that unless power is controlled by the one wielding the power, power will always become destructive. This is why many ages came and went and passed into history, because the powers that be in each age, firstly the angels, and then the men, like Lucifer, were not able to control the power that God gave them, and that power eventually destroyed them, as well as the worlds around them. This is why there is so much evidence of worlds and civilizations having come and gone around this earth, which don't just date back 5,000 years, but much, much, much older than that. This is the history of those ages. History was, and it still is, God's classroom. In this classroom, he has brought to to his creatures, the knowledge of his power. First, his power to create, when he made the heavens and the earth. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, and then he stretched out the heavens. And when he was with the angels and the sons of God, in Job 8, we can read that, they shouted for joy when they saw him laying the foundation of the earth. This was a demonstration to them of his creative power. Okay, first his power to create, and then his power to destroy. And finally, that what made him all powerful, the Almighty, was the fact that he alone was able to handle all power. See, God is Almighty because he can handle all power. Power destroys, okay, but not God, and we'll see why. And he was able to handle all power because he is all love. The revelation that God is love is the ultimate revelation of God to all his creatures. But there was one creature to whom this revelation was not just given, but in whom this revelation was birthed, and that creature is man. Before the ultimate revelation that God is love could be unveiled to his creatures, ages of time had to pass in which evil would be born, and it would grow, and eventually it would become absolute. Absolute darkness would come into existence, so that God's absolute light could be made manifest to his creatures. Death would enter into God's creation, so that in the process of time, God's love would swallow up death in victory, and the ultimate revelation would arise in man's heart that the greatest destructive power that has ever existed, a power that no one could conquer, the power of death itself, could not overcome the power of love. See, people just assume that the knowledge of good and the knowledge of life, the knowledge of love, it's, just floating around in the air that anybody can understand. But they don't understand the great price at which God has brought us this knowledge. This was one of the reasons why God had to suffer evil. He had to endure the existence of evil in his creation, although he himself is absolutely good, is because evil is the opposite of good, and therefore the opposite of God. It is because darkness exists that we can understand light. It is because death exists that we can understand and value life. Until these things existed, as for example in the Golden Age when everything was perfect, those inhabitants of that age, they did not understand these things. The angels stood in the presence of God Almighty, who is life, and yet they did not understand life. Okay? Those people, they were light. Angels, the Bible tells us, are light, yet they did not understand light. So these are the things that needed to happen in order for us to bring us the understanding of what good means, of what life means, of what light means, of what joy, peace, all good things what they mean, because when we began to understand them, then we would begin to understand God, because He is all of those things. And of course, the defining characteristic or the defining quality of God, the ultimate defining quality is that God is love. And you think that the knowledge of love was just, that you're born and without any kind of experience, you would be able to understand it? No. The knowledge of love came to God, was brought to us by God through sacrifice, and that is the only way it could have been brought to us. Love can only be proven by sacrifice. This is a subject which I will expound on in greater detail at a later time. And this is how God proved His love, by sacrificing Himself to save His creatures whom He loves. I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here because I want to not only discuss why history happened, but also what happened in history. But they go hand in hand. If you want to understand real history, you have to understand the events that happened, but why they happened. The first ages of history taught God's creatures how power will destroy those who have knowledge but not love. Firstly, the angels, and then Lucifer, and now Satan, all had power, and they have all had power and have power, but they knew not how to love. Therefore, their power, which was given to them by God, eventually destroyed them. Even as those first ages and worlds were being destroyed, God was setting the stage when He Himself would demonstrate His love to weak and mortal man, so that he could then, meaning man, could then be transformed on the inside into a completely new race of beings who, like God, are not just able to love, but they are love. So, except for the Golden Age, the subsequent ages have all been ages of evil. The history of those ages is the history of evil, from its birth in the race of angels to its becoming absolute darkness in Satan in the process of time. Yet without evil and without death, the sacrifice of love could not be offered. And man, the vessel chosen to be love, as God is love, would forever have remained weak and corrupt, and a destroyer rather than a builder, as the history of the ages proved again and again and again. So evil had to infect God's creation according to God's plans and purposes, so that the ultimate secret to God's power could finally be revealed in the very last of the ages, which is the revelation that God is love, and that love alone can wield all power, be all powerful without being destructive. There is an old adage that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is always true, except in the case of the power of love, which can control all powers and is therefore all powerful. We know and understand these truths today because these truths were painstakingly and very patiently revealed to us by our Creator. And as I said before, in the case of man, they were not just revealed to us, they were revealed in us. So what is the difference between something being revealed to a person and that same something being revealed in a person? In contrast to the race of angels, who at present are greater than man in knowledge and power, mankind was chosen from before the foundation of the world to be that special race of creatures which God created, not just to reveal Himself to them, but to reveal Himself in them. God brings revelation to man from the inside by writing it on his heart and on his mind. Knowledge can be inputted from the outside in. Okay? There are two ways of acquiring knowledge. Okay? One is from the outside in. Let me just explain to you by giving you an example. For example, a teacher in a classroom attempts to share knowledge with students that he hopes will become understanding. Knowledge will become understanding in their mind when they come to understand what that knowledge means. This is an outside-in method of sharing knowledge and information. In the inside-out method that God uses with man, He does not just share knowledge, but He shares His mind. It would be as if the teacher could simply clone his mind onto the mind of the student. So the student wouldn't understand a subject because the teacher explained it to him, but that the knowledge of the subject would be exactly the same as it is in the teacher's mind, because the teacher's mind and the student's mind would be one and the same. Similarly, God's love was not just shown to man. God literally took his own heart out and put it in man. As an example, a man may truly love a woman and try and prove this to her by being affectionate to her, by telling her that he loves her. But no matter what he does, the only way that the woman could fully understand that man's love, the way he loves her, would be if he took his heart and placed it inside her so that she would feel exactly what he feels for her. On the cross, Jesus Christ, who is God in the flesh, had his heart pierced by a Roman soldier. And this is symbolic of our Creator ripping out his own heart, literally taking it out and giving it to us. It is this price that was paid on the cross that made it possible for us to have the same mind and the same heart as that of our Creator. History is generally taught to be thought as a series of random events, or in the case of even Christians teaching history, it's almost as if they're telling us that God had these afterthoughts, that he started doing something, then in afterthought, let's do it this way, let's change here, let's do something went wrong, let me just correct that. That is not at all how it happened. God planned everything right from the beginning, and as I said, history is a series of revelations over many ages that have revealed to us who God, our Creator, is. It has revealed to us his power, both in creating, and in destroying, but more importantly, it has revealed to us his character, what he is on the inside, and what we have discovered is that he is love. And how man, as mankind, this is what makes man special in God's creation, is that man is able to understand this, that God is love, not just by hearing it, but actually by having that love replicated in his very own heart. The Bible says, the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given to us. So that love readily bubbles out from the inside of us. Okay? Therefore, we not only know that God loves us with our mind, we actually experience it with our heart. And this is why we are able to love our Creator, which just means that we can have an interaction of love with him. We can relate to him with the same love that he loves us. In that example that I gave you, the man and the woman, if the man who truly and fully loves a woman places his own heart inside of her so that she begins to feel exactly what he feels, then they have a relationship which is going to be powerful, because one's love is going to be duplicated and reciprocated by the other. Okay, that is a perfect relationship, and that is the only perfect relationship that exists, is a relationship of perfect love. But before all this could happen, God had to perfect us in love. So history is literally his story, meaning God's story, and it is a love story. All the events of history, like the ages such as the Golden Age and the Silver Age, etc., these events that happened in those ages, these are almost like sideshows. They are not the main event. Okay, like when you go to a wrestling or a boxing match, for example, they have these fights that are leading up to the main event. But that's not why people go there. They go there for the main event. And the main event of history is how God has worked diligently from the day in Genesis 1:1 that he created the heaven and then the earth. From that time until this very day, he is working in us. And love, I talked about love being perfected. Love can only be perfected from the inside out. It cannot be perfected from the outside in. For example, the Israelites, those of you who know biblical history, they were given a commandment in Deuteronomy 6:5, which said, Moses said to them, and you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. So they had this commandment, but they were not ever able to keep that commandment because they had not that love inside of them. And it is until God started working inside them, by being inside of them, by being inside their hearts, and showing them in their heart, revealing to them, inside of their hearts, the love he had for them, that people would begin to understand that their Creator, God, truly loves them. And then they would begin to love him in return. But until he was able to do this miracle, love was not possible. It is like a man, like I said, if he can, in the woman's heart, begin to reveal to her in her heart the love that he has for her, in time, that woman will come to love him in the same measure. And that, or the woman, if she could show the man that the love she has for him in her heart, by being in his heart, then that man would also turn and eventually love him. This is what has been happening in history. This is the main event in history. It is the replication or the writing of God's love in the ink of his blood onto our hearts. However, the question that some may ask is, why was this not done right in the beginning? Why did we have to go through this process of evil and pain and mortality and death and all the negative things that have happened since the beginning of creation? And the answer to that question is that God could not put his love inside of us until his own love had been tested and tried. And it had to pass through the fires of evil. That is what has been happening since the day in Ezekiel chapter 28, when iniquity was found in that anointed cherub. From that moment onwards, God's love has been on trial. It has been put to the test. It has been the fires. It has been passing through the fires of the trials, fiery trials, and he has passed each one of those trials until on the cross of Jesus Christ, he passed the final trial, which was victory over death. And it is not until that love had been perfected, God's own love had been perfected. This is something people may have a hard time understanding. By saying that God's love had been perfected, I mean that it had been tested. It is like, if you build a plane, for example, that is going to fly at Mach 10, you say, oh, this is a supersonic plane, it's going to fly at Mach 10. It is not actually until you take it out for a test flight and everything is proven to be working perfectly that you can actually say that you actually now have a plane that can fly at Mach 10 without any problems. This is why God's love could not be placed in our hearts until that love had been put to the test. As a matter of fact, in Hebrews, it is written about Christ Jesus that he was made perfect through sufferings. Now, the Bible also tells us that Christ was God in the flesh. So, if you understand that, what is happening? What does it mean that, God was made perfect? Is God not perfect in the beginning already? Yes, of course he is perfect and his love is perfect. But until the love had been tried and tested, it wouldn't be called perfect love, because God himself would not know whether it would pass or fail the test. So he had to put it to the test. He had to light the fire of evil under it, let it burn in it completely, and come out of it victorious by defeating all of the evil that comes, that all of the pain and suffering and all the negative that evil brings. He faced it, he faced the challenge, and he overcame it on the cross of Jesus Christ. That is what happened. This is what history is all about. Okay? And it is because all this has happened that we are now being transformed on our insights. Okay? So those of us who know what I'm saying, who have God living inside of them, and they understand this love that is shed abroad in their hearts, that they love God and they don't even understand why. It is because that love has been taken from God's heart and it has been placed in our hearts. This is the greatest gift that God has given to us, and I wish that every person listening to the words of my voice would seek him and seek this love, because there is no greater gift, there is no greater treasure that is available to us than this, and love is life, and you will have eternal life. You will have all power. Like Jesus said, all power has been given to me. The power of creation, the power of science, the power of knowledge, the power of whatever, genetics, etc. It'll all be given to us freely, because God now knows that he can give it to these creatures who are perfect in love, because that love that is inside them will be able to control that power. And because the angels and Lucifer and Satan, they did not have that love inside of them, that power eventually became a fire inside of them, and it destroyed them. So in the next video, I will discuss the Silver Age, in which the growth of evil accelerated, so that that is where we have these creatures that are today called evil spirits or demons. Their origin lies in those days, long time before Adam and Eve or before Noah. And they are still in us today. They live in all around, but in a dimension which is not visible to the physical eye. And this is where we will understand, where do these creatures that seem to be very human, that are worshipped as gods, such as like Zeus or Rama or Krishna, or Thor and all these characters, where did they come from? And were they human? Were they angelic? Were they spirit? Were they flesh and blood? These are the type of questions, the answers to which are certainly available. And I will be discussing that in the next video. But today, again, before I finish off, let me talk a little bit more about this golden age and what happened in it so very long ago, perhaps millions and millions of years ago. In the Bible, there is a period of time from the beginning of creation until sin and evil entered into God's creation, which is the golden age. This is that period of time on which all the mythologies base and tell us, they talk about the golden age or the Satya Yuga in the Hindus, where they talk about this time of wonderful peace and prosperity and of, joy and of fulfillment and of no lack and no hunger and no sickness and no disease and no death. And these stories, even though in mythology is twisted history. There are great truths in mythology, but all mythology is not true, because mythology does not lead people to Jesus Christ, which if they were absolutely true, that's where they would lead them. But there are great deal of truth in it still, because all lies are ultimately based on some truth. So this idea of this golden age, like I said, which is found in just about every culture and every religion and every tradition and every myth and every legend all over the world, speaking of this golden time, it did in fact exist. In Genesis 1:1, we read, "In the beginning God created the heaven and the earth." Okay, he created these two places, the heaven and the earth, which were perfect. Okay, as a matter of fact, even before he created the earth, he created the angels and men. He created the angels that would be the rulers of the heavens that he was going to form later, and he created the earth, which would be the habitation of men that he created, those men who are called the sons of God in the Bible. Okay, in Job 38, we can read, that God, when he laid the foundation of the earth, the morning stars were angels sang together, and the sons of God shouted for joy, because they were now seeing a demonstration of God's power as the earth itself came into existence, and it left them in awe and wonder. And this is where their education began as to the creative power of God. This is the power that he shared some of it with them. And I believe they were also instrumental in building, of course, the men that he placed on the earth, those sons of God. They built the first worlds. These worlds were, like I said, technological marvels, like the stories of Atlantis, in which they had everything from electricity to super, transportation machines and such things. And it's hard to imagine even at this time what it must have been like, because for one thing, we know that all traces of those worlds are pretty much gone. It is like the present day world, which is a technological world, in which our construction methods and our information storage methods, they are not carved in stone as in some of the other ages they were. Okay, we build out of like wood and plastics and glass and such things. And or if the world was to be destroyed, all traces of their existence would pretty much be wiped out within a matter of some centuries at the most. Okay, they would just rot away and disappear. And if all information was stored on desks and computers, etc., it would be instantaneously lost. And this is what happened. So if people start looking, then these videos that's playing on your screen, for example, of all these megalithic structures, these are not from the golden age. I believe these structures, which are the giant structures, etc., they were built at a later time, probably in the Bronze Age, which comes before this Iron Age, not in the Gold Age or the Silver Age. The Golden Age and the Silver Ages would be something like out of a Star Wars movie, very sophisticated technologically and very, very advanced. Because after that Golden Age, everything that came, that it deteriorated. So this golden age, which I'm not going to speak about much more, because we want to get into the more into the history of evil, which begins with the Silver Age, which will be my next video. And but in the Golden Age, I have posted some videos, a couple of videos at least on this, and more. One in particular titled "Before the Angels Fell: The Golden Age of Creation." The link to which is in the description is a good one to watch if you want to understand that, yeah, these type of worlds have come and gone. And so that period of time, it came from Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth, which were perfect. This perfect world we can read about in Job 38. We can also read about in Proverbs chapter 8. How great God made everything in perfection by measurements, by, weighing things, by understanding that in wisdom, how a world ought to be created. Okay. So he did it all. That happened. And that was the world of perfection in which men dwelt. They were delightful. The Bible says that at that time the wisdom of God's delights took delight in the men of that age. And of course, we know that from Adam onwards, there were not really any men that were delightful to God, except for perhaps, two or three, like Enoch, Abel and Enoch, and maybe Noah. Other than that, like there were not any men that were a delight to God. But that age, which was the golden age, the people of that age were a delight. And that age lasted until Ezekiel chapter 28, in which we read about this leader of the race of angels, called the anointed cherub, who was the father of evil in God's creation, till the day that iniquity was found in him. So this period of time from Genesis 1:1 to Ezekiel chapter 28, when iniquity or sin or evil entered God's creation, is the period of time of the golden age, in which death did not exist, in which darkness did not exist, in which evil did not exist, in which there was no corruption, there was no hunger, there was no sickness, there was no disease. But they built, and I think that they were also at least engaged in the building of the heavens themselves. Because in the order of creation that we find in the Bible, God made these two places first, the heaven and the earth, and the heavens, we are told, were stretched out later. And since the angels and the men had already come into existence, it stands to reason that they were also instrumental in the building of the heavens themselves, which tells us how much knowledge and understanding that God gave them. And it is because they had such a great amount of knowledge and understanding, but not the knowledge of love. And I'll explain later as to why it was impossible for them to have understood what love means, that their power and their knowledge eventually turned to destruction and evil. As I said, power corrupts. As it has been said, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. This anointed cherub, who had been given more power than any other creature in God's creation from then, I believe, until now, he, of course, after a certain period of time, which could be thousands or tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, I don't know how long, he did eventually, that power did corrupt him, and that is how evil entered into God's creation. This is something, of course, God knew would happen, that if you give somebody power and knowledge without, them having an understanding of love, that power will eventually corrupt them. And as I said, this is a revelation that people had to be brought to us, that what is power and how is it to be used and how is it not to be used. These things had to be demonstrated and shown, and therefore there had to exist some creatures in whom these demonstrations and these events would occur that would prove to us and teach us what is meant by power and why power alone, it is not sufficient to give somebody a great deal of knowledge and a great deal of power without also showing them and giving them what love is, because if that does not happen, they will certainly turn to evil and in the end destroy themselves and everything around them. But it was not possible until evil entered into God's creation for God to demonstrate his love. Because, as I said, love is proven by sacrifice, by giving, by pain, by suffering on the behalf of somebody else. And until those things existed in God's creation, there was no way for God to prove them that He loved them. So they had a relationship, they interacted with God, but not on the spiritual level of love, which was the only safe way for them to be able to handle all that power that God had given them. And that power, as we read again in Ezekiel, God says, I will bring out a fire from the midst of thee, which shall, reduce thee to ashes in the sight of all. And that is exactly what happens. The power that was given to this anointed cherub, it burned inside of him in the end, and it burned and destroyed him. God's power, on the other hand, does not destroy. God is all powerful, like I said. But for example, at the time of the burning bush, when Moses saw the bush was burning, but it was not destroyed. The bush was on fire, but that fire did not destroy the bush. And that is symbolic of God's love, that it is a fire that is hot, but it does not burn and destroys. It actually heals and brings life. Okay? So that is basically the story of the Golden Age, my friends, that it was a period of time at the beginning of creation when this world, the first world that existed on this earth, was built. It was that built, I believe the myths of places like Atlantis, they harken back to that time because those were technologically marvel wonder worlds that existed, okay, where they had communication technologies the like of which we do not have today. They had transportation technologies the like of which we don't have today. They had construction technologies the likes of which we don't have today. They had knowledge of science and physics and biology and genetics and all that, which we even do not have until today. They had all this knowledge and understanding. The one thing that they lacked was love. And it is not until evil came that their education in love could begin. And that's what's going to bring us to the next stage of creation, which is the Silver Age. Now, as you see in this graphic on the screen, the Golden Age is generally thought to have lasted the longest of all, which kind of makes sense to me, because if it is a time when there is no evil and there is no deterioration, then it is a time of building. Then it seems that it is not going to, it can last forever, essentially. But once evil entered in, what entered in was corruption. Everything began to deteriorate. Okay? And this deterioration accelerated. So that, as you see in that chart, the Silver Age is shown to be of a shorter duration than the Golden Age. Okay? Because although the Silver Age, as we shall see, was still very advanced technologically and technically than what we have even today, it was in a state of corruption and deterioration. It was beginning to turn to ruin. And the longer the time went by, the more things began to be destroyed rather to be built. So again, it makes sense that it was shorter in duration than the Golden Age. And finally, when we get to the Bronze Age, that was of even shorter duration, because by the time the Silver Age came to an end, this whole idea of wars and destructions and killings, and it had become the norm rather than the exception, which it was at the beginning of the Silver Age even, that destruction, it moved along at a much faster pace than it ever before. So each age became successively shorter. And even compared to the Bronze Age, I believe this Iron Age, which literally is only about 6,000 years, and it won't be much longer than that. It is the shortest of the ages. And yet, there is more that has happened in this age than all the other ages combined, because it is in this age that God finished that work which He set out to do, which was to bring to us the revelation, bring in us, to create in us, to reveal in us the knowledge of His love. Okay? So, next video, I will speak about the Silver Age. I'll move on to the Silver, Bronze, and the Iron Ages, and we shall continue to study history, which is recorded in the pages of the Bible. And again, like I said, not just to understand what happened, but more importantly, why it happened, and even more importantly, why it must have happened in order to fulfill the plans and purposes of our Creator. Thank you for listening. This is Paul Sandhu.
Oh, I got the love of Jesus. Oh, I got the love of the Lord. Oh, I got the love of Jesus. I got it deep down, oh yeah, into my soul. I think you ought to help me to say, yeah, the love of Jesus. Oh, I got the love of the Lord. Oh, I got the love of Jesus. Oh, I got it deep down, oh yeah, in my soul. Think you ought to help me to say that I got the love, yeah, the love of Jesus. Oh, I got the love of the Lord. Yeah, I got the love of Jesus. Oh, I got it deep down, oh yeah, in my soul. Let me say this, yeah. Sometimes on this journey, I don't know what to do. I can always look to Jesus. I know He will, oh yeah, see me through. I think you ought to help me to say, yeah, the love of Jesus. Whoa, I got the love of the Lord. Yeah, I got the love of Jesus. Oh, I got it deep down, oh yeah, in my soul. Yeah, let me tell y'all about the love I have. The love of Jesus. Oh yeah, love of Jesus. Oh yeah, love of Jesus. Love of Jesus. Love of Jesus. I know